defense modernization and the intelligence community's role in addressing threats posed by our strategic competitors. He's promised he might scare us a little bit today before we hear from our panel, so let's see what we have to hear from.
Well, I want to thank the National Security Institute and NSI for bringing this panel together, for all the work that you do on bringing issues forward that are important to our national security. I want to thank the panel, not only for their work today, but also their continuing work to bring forward issues that are important to us. I want to acknowledge Kelly Repair, who's sitting in the audience, who was General Counsel to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence when I served as its chairman. I'm going to talk about an issue that arose while I was chairman of the Intelligence Committee. And I've been asked to give you a little window into that issue because it sort of arcs over, unintended, the issue of that you're going to be discussing today in a way that I think really wakes us all up to how this threat unfolds to us. Now, I always like to go back to the beginning, and that is to give us this view of what we're facing, and that is that the space age began when Russia in 1957 launched Sputnik. Before 1957, we had no concept of the fact that there would be a space age. When Sputnik was launched, the conversation began as to even what the space age would mean. How would it transform our lives? We were all tertiary when we had both in the issue of technology and our view of how information related, how technology would relate. The space age opened our view as both dimensionally and technology as to how we would apply that we would function. On February 14th in 2024, as chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee, I requested that with my committee, the Biden administration declassify all information relating to Russia's space-based nuclear threat. The Biden administration then declassified information that Russia was developing a space-based nuclear anti-satellite weapon, and that is they were intending to put into space an anti-satellite nuclear weapon. And there are many anti-satellite weapons. Those anti-satellite weapons tend to be targeted toward another specific satellite. An anti-satellite nuclear weapon that is nuclear is a nuclear weapon that would detonate in space and would have effects on the orbit of detonation, not just a specific satellite. General Saltzman of Space Force has coined the phrase that would be day zero. That would be the end of the space age when not that detonation occurred, but when that anti-satellite was put into space. Because he says that when that anti-satellite was put into space, that upon its launch, the next day, it would be irresponsible for us that next day to rely on space. Now think of that. He's saying that it's not the detonation where the detonation would then have its impact, which I'm going to discuss, on that orbit, but that next day we would begin absolutely to be required to begin to operate with not being able to rely on space the next day. Now think about that. So the United Nations Outer Space Treaty in 1967 that was signed by the Russian Federation states that no nation shall place nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit on or on celestial bodies or station them in outer space in any other manner. The treaty reflected a unified desire to advance mankind into its portable, manifest destiny. Now, why is that? The signatories of the treaty could not have imagined the world of today where agriculture, medicine, commercial transactions, communications, maritime navigation, international security, and even our ability to tell time is space dependent. Now think about this. There's nothing that we do every day that isn't touched by space. Agriculture, even the way our farmers work, is space dependent. Medicine, commercial transactions, communication, maritime navigation, international security, and even our ability to tell time is space dependent. If a Russian nuclear anti-satellite weapon is detonated in low Earth orbit, LEO, it would indiscriminately decimate all satellites within LEO orbit and would render that orbit and space unusable for likely a year. Now, Dr. Plum testifying before the House Armed Services Committee, who confirmed that it would likely make it unusable for a year, went on to indicate that mankind therefore would be unable to repopulate LEO satellites during this period, and manned space exploration would be deadly. Think of it, no Artemis 2. How do you get through it? Every aspect of modern life relies on space in some form. A denial of LEO would be a denial of modern services critical to sustain life as we know it. So that's why General Saltzman is saying if it's in orbit, it would be day 0, because that next day, even if it's detonated, we would immediately have to configure ourselves in a way with trillions of dollars we don't have and technology we don't have. We would begin to have to plan for agriculture, medicine, commercial transactions, communications, maritime navigation, national security, and our ability to tell time in a manner where we have to assume that LEO perhaps is not available. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia has become more reliant on space. Their use of unmanned aerial systems and counter unmanned aircraft does make them more reliant. However, their incentive of placing this anti-satellite in space is that they have the ability to hold the world hostage. If you don't allow us to do X, we will detonate this anti-satellite and decimate LEO. Therefore, as we take up the issue of congestion, we have to take up the issue of threats to space, not just anti-satellite, but anti-orbital satellites. And with that, I will leave you with your discussion that you're going to have, that our dependence on space is at risk by those who are currently not just threatening, not just claiming that they may design, not just claiming that they may have intent, not just claiming that they may violate a treaty, but according to disclosures by the Biden administration, have taken the step to actually threaten that they would violate the treaty and put something in orbit that would threaten day 0. Gentlemen, thank you.
I'm going to quickly introduce our panel. Thank you so much for the remarks we've heard. So today joining us are Lieutenant General David Miller, Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Strategy, Commands, Programs, and Requirements at the U.S. Space Force. Eric Nelson, Vice President of Space Intelligence and Western Systems Business Development at Boeing Defense, Space and Security, and Russell Wamba, Deputy Executive Director of the Space for Space Policy and Strategy of the Aerospace Corporation. And lucky today, leading today's conversation is NSI's own fellow David Gauthier, who's Chief Strategy Officer at GSO. David, all yours.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to National Security Institute for hosting and Representative Turner for leading us off with scaring us with day 0 in space. We often hear the phrase that space is more congested and contested than ever, but we don't often stop to think, what does contested mean? In a domain without clear borders, everything becomes a global commons in space, but some areas above our heads are more valuable than others. Space is full of incredible resources that can unlock humanity's potential, generate immense economic opportunity, and help add to the wealth and power of nations. But contested means that we have to fight for a share of these resources, and we have to demand freedom to maneuver in space. And we'll have to struggle for the sustainability of this environment itself. Our adversaries, as we just heard, will seek to disrupt, degrade, or destroy these space systems. And it's already commonplace to have electronic interference known as jamming, to have communications intercepts like eavesdropping, and even see displays of dominance like showboating in orbit, which I'm sure we'll hear more about. Today, we really benefit from the 3 gentlemen sitting to my right. An expert panel will help explain how we navigate from freedom in this space domain to living with contested orbits. And so I want to start with Lieutenant General David Miller. And quick note for his bio, he was the commander of the 460th Space Wing at Buddy, and a young space operator. That's where I cut my teeth driving satellites. So I thought that was fun. And we'll basically have you and then the rest of the panelists address the first question. The U.S. has operated in space with relative freedom for decades. And before we get into specific policy questions, let's level set. What is one thing that has fundamentally changed about the orbital environment in the last 5 years? And what should policymakers on the Hill understand about where things stand today?
There's no one thing, but I'll try to summarize it. Now that everybody's scared and worried about day zero. I think if I had to summarize, Space Force turned 6 years old in December. So I'm going to go back just almost to a decade a bit. But I think the one thing that people need to understand about, at least the military's perspective on this, is that the definition that has been talked about really since the inception of Space Force, but actually in 1998 was the first time I heard it, when Secretary Rumsfeld at the time was leading the Space Commission, was the transition to a warfighting domain and what that really means. You got to understand when I was in Air Force Space Command as a supporting arm to the Air Force, space was assumed to be a sanctuary. It was engineered for efficiency, literally and figuratively. What is the minimum number of satellites with the maximum amount of stuff that we can put on orbit with the minimum amount of launches to drive the minimum amount of cost? Does that make sense? It was just the minimums that we could do. And that posture let us do things like announce how many missile warning satellites we have and project for everybody when they're launching, where they're going, and what they're doing. And that was my first mission as a young captain in missile warning. And that approach is an approach that invites aggression. It tells adversaries what your dependencies are. It makes you dependent on what General Hype used to call big, fat, juicy targets. There's only a handful of them. I don't got many of them. And it is also something that is understated often. We actually sized the U.S. military 40 years ago, assuming access to space. The Navy forewent aerial surveillance capabilities that they would launch from carriers and carrier task groups and relied on space to provide indications and warning. They let go of signals intelligence collection assets and relied on space in order to provide them. They let go of navigation and other platforms, sized their battle groups. When I say that the fundamental shift over the past really 10 years in particular, where this domain is contested and congested, is because we are not just engineered for efficiency anymore. We have to design for a fight and be able to win that fight for space superiority. So that when Congress is talking about freedom of action and our ability to leverage space for all those reasons that David just mentioned, most of them are not actually military or national security reasons that we operate in space. Many of them are civil and commercial advantages that we derive, let alone economic and priority advantages that we derive from space. But somebody has to be realistic about the prospects of the threat that we face and begin to design our structure, posture our forces, size our formations, and ready them for what is ultimately going to be a fight. Now, we'll talk about what the threat looks like in a minute, but I think that's the biggest realization that I've seen as I go around, as I talk to universities, as I talk to parents when I'm commissioned, they're young lieutenants, is a realization that this is no longer an assumed sanctuary and that this is going to be a fight for space superiority. And frankly, the questions about, do we need a space force are legitimate questions. Also ask questions of, do you want to pay for the Navy that it would take to have if we didn't have space as a weapon? Right now, the Space Force, I'm the budget guy too, so I got to throw money in this. We're less than 5% of the Department of War's budget. And every military service is dependent on this. Every one of them sized their forces, assuming access to navigation and timing, surveillance and targeting information, GPS precision guided munitions. Every one of them sized their munitions buys, their platforms, all of it, assuming access to space superiority. And we gained a lot of efficiency from that, candidly, in terms of resourcing the Department of War. When we talk about a budget like we have now and the need for growth in Space Force, and I give you in context the PLA or the People's Liberation Army Space Force is between 45 and 65,000 people We are trying to minimally grow the Space Force to 25K to cover all the new missions we have. That's context. No longer engineered for efficiency, designing a force to fight with. That's the big difference.
Wow, okay, thank you for that. All right, we'll go to Russell next. Quick note on his bio, 2 times in the Office of Secretary of Defense, cost assessment and program evaluations. You just love budget, right?
Here with the
You
general,
love the
just to
numbers.
support it.
Oh, man. Okay, yeah, same question for you. What's one thing that's fundamentally changed in the space environment, and what should policymakers know?
Thanks, David. Thanks to NSI for doing this. And I think the general's already told you, and I just want to emphasize it, the biggest, and I also think he's right to slip to 5 years. As the general just said, Space Force just hit 6 years. Such a big event that shapes how all of the policy conversation has, that we have an S5A to turn to hear from, that Space Force even exists is a huge thing to keep in mind. The general just gave a lot of the context for that. You have seen it come, how recent that is, that we have a military service dedicated to space, and how much that changes what the U.S. does in its policy responses, how the U.S. prepares for what is coming. If you force me to live within the 5 years, it is the proliferated architectures. 10 years ago, people were talking about it, but nobody was sure it would really work, and now they are here, exist. That changes the nature of contested, and certainly changes the nature of congested as well. But even then, it is the Space Force that is putting the US's proliferated architectures out, its military architectures out, and just emphasizes how important the creating Space Force is.
And another big proliferator is the Chinese government and their commercial industry. Huge number of satellites going up. So, yeah, thank you for mentioning that. We'll ask the same question of Eric. Pull from your bio, senior analyst at Phantom Works in Boeing, right? Very spooky stuff there.
Fun.
Fun.
We call it
Right.
fun.
Fun.
Or cleared for weird, depending on the kind of community you're part of. So I echo what the general said. Very, very well said. I would maybe think from the industry perspective. He described how we had created efficiency in space that drove to the efficiency in industry. That meant you were building one thing that would go up in geostationary Earth orbit and last for 25 years, not hundreds of things that would go into low Earth orbit and last for 36 months and need to be replenished at a rate to update as fast as your iPhone would turn. So I think that's one thing I would say from what's happened historically to today of what's going on in industry, and you see that evolving with a bunch of new entrants. That's going to create more congestion in space with the sale of bandwidth to enable 5G and 6G, so direct to device from satellite. That is ongoing now with the government. So I think you're going to see a lot more congestion. And then what it means from a threat perspective, when we think about investments to support our customer, we'll make investments in capital and capacity. And when I look at the documents this Force puts out on the future operating environment in 2040, it really lines out the threat, so the bad guys, for lack of a better analogy. And when you see the bad guys going from demonstration to fielding of capability, that's when we need to worry. So I kind of feel like we're past that point of, I've tried a few things, now I'm actually deploying things. I think that's where we also kind of think that the demand signal from the customer and the budget alignment is really important. And I echo what you said, Russell. If you think about the productivity gains and efficiency that space has provided our country for the last number of decades, what's the cost of losing those productivity gains versus funding the presidential budget request and thinking about growth in the Space Force to help offset any of those potential other efficiencies that might go away if there was some action in space?
Okay, thank you. Okay, Lieutenant General Miller, you teased it a little bit about the threat. So let's talk about orbital warfare. The Space Force is talking more publicly than ever about direct threats to our on-orbit platforms. The DIA has produced unclassified counter space threat reports that talk about high-powered microwaves, jammers, lasers, sprayers, grapplers, kinetic kill vehicles. It seems like there's a lot to be worried about. In this, how do you characterize the severity of the threat we're facing? and how does the current posture match up?
Yeah, dependent, my boss is General Husband, and depending on which leader is given their testimony, it's like which adjective can outdo the last adjective. So I think I heard mind-boggling. I can't remember what General Whiting said at the time. Suffice it to say that the threat has grown at a scope, scale, and pace that is staggering in many respects. When you consider that our Space Force, which was preceded 4 years previous by the Russian and People's Liberation Army Space Forces, is only 6 years old. When you look at the threat that we have to contend with, I think it's just safe to say that the scope and lethality of that threat is far more pronounced, and it's staggering. What do I mean when I say that? Certainly the threats on orbit is real. Whether it is non-kinetic or non-destructive capabilities or kinetic or destructive capabilities, there is no safe orbit anywhere. The adversaries have demonstrated, fielded, and as you said, moved from demonstration to fielding of capability in every orbital regime. And as you've seen in the press, in some cases, Russia's an example, where they will launch directly to the orbital plane of some of our most sensitive assets. Why would you do that? There is we wouldn't tolerate that for our airborne assets. But that is a condition that is the reality now, particularly the last 4 launches of an anti-satellite kinetic capability that the Russians have fielded. You've seen in the press. Every time they launch right into an orbit of a very sensitive national security space system that we own and operate, the U.S. government. But the threat is not just in space and to space. Threat to the joint force is almost as much so, if not more so, staggering. The development of I'll use the People's Liberation Army as an example. You've seen numbers over 500 different ISR, or intelligence, surveillance, or reconnaissance platforms. And the only way to interpret this fielding timeline and approach is that it is a direct threat to air and maritime forces of the United States in the Pacific and around the world. That they want, down to the minute, clarity and accuracy in the ability to find, fix, target, track, and engage U.S. air and maritime forces, primarily in the Pacific, but ultimately globally. When you factor in, they have launched in 2021 a fractional orbital bombardment system, which is just what it sounds like. It didn't wind up completing a complete orbit, but that was by choice, not by physics. The capability to re-enter, approach from southern trajectories, and deliver potentially nuclear payloads from space that had been maintained in orbit. That is something that technologically had existed in the past. We have chosen not to do it because it is so destabilizing. And then when you factor in the amount of sheer breadth of the communications, command and control, and cyber capabilities that the People's Liberation Army is fielding as a part of their own kill web, it is staggering what they're fielding and what pace they're doing. And as much as people have talked about, the challenge Russia has had, and they have had, of developing and fielding, reconstituting in some cases their army, they have not been in their pursuit of counter space technologies, whether that's directed energy weapons, as I mentioned, some counter space or ASAT capabilities. The congressman talked about a space-based nuclear arm anti-satellite capability. I mean, it is staggering what you have seen in recent years. So you say, well, how do we measure up against it? I think when you look at what we have put in the 27 budget, and like I said, 1998 was the first time I had a conversation about an independent space force. At that time, it was going to be an independent space corps in the United States Air Force. This is the most balanced program I have ever seen that delivers a resilient, combat-credible space force purpose-built to fight and win space superiority. We had an executive order that directed it. We had a national defense strategy, I think, clear-eyed about this threat, and now we're in the process of getting to field the systems. So to counter those and protect our systems, we are both complementing both a combination of proliferation as well as maneuver as part of our infrastructure. Instead of where I was deployed in many units as a young lieutenant or company grade officer, and there was one squadron that did one thing. Force Ops was the only unit that did protecting tactical SATCOM. We have gone away from that. We moved to resilient units, generating multiple systems, multiple unit capabilities and being able to operate from multiple locations, with independent power, cooling, and cybersecurity associated with each of those platforms. We have gone to a deployed architecture or forward posture architecture throughout the globe to spread the risk evenly across our enterprise. We have gone to a more readiness state, an increased readiness state, to allow us to posture more effectively for active events where required. I think the Space Force has taken the task, and I think frankly, even though some thought when we had focused on asking our allies to invest, that somehow that would indicate a lessening of the U.S. investment, I think this program for the president's budget shows that that is not correct. This is the most significant budget lift specifically for the Department of War, but when you look at what in particular is there in the Space Force, it is also significant. And as a recognition of what I said earlier, this entire joint force is dependent on space power. And there's no going back, because the option to build the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps that isn't will be even more expensive to go back. So we have to build a capability to defend it, to engage where needed, but most importantly, to deter conflict. And I think that the program actually does that. So I think we're getting to a place where, I mean, I'll never be happy, I'll tell you that as a Cape guy. I always want more. But I think we're getting to a place where we're starting to feel a level of resilient combat credible force structure that we would have never gotten to with Air Force Space Command as a supporting arm to the combat air forces. That's just, we'd never have gotten there.
All right, fantastic, thank you. Okay, we'll turn to you, Russell. Since we talked about the budget a little bit already, we'll keep talking about defense spending in this regard. The U.S. is investing tens of billions in space-based missile defense through Golden Dome, while simultaneously trying to build more resilient satellite architectures across the board to fight and win in space if we have to. Are we resourcing the entire space domain in a way that matches the threat, or are there still structural gaps that persist?
I told you I was just here to provide the numbers for the general. He laid out the broader scope, but let's talk about the specifics, right? In FY21, the last budget of the first Trump administration, Space Force is $15 billion. FY24, the last version of the Biden budget, $30 billion. The program the general just referenced, reconciliation spending, sat for a couple of years right there about that 30 billion mark. This year, the president's request is $70 billion. At that $30 billion mark, so are we resourcing? We are certainly now resourcing space in large ways, right? Those are very quick drops. You can see why the general has to reference other generals using wild adjectives as we all come to terms with this just fundamentally different scale. To put that in context a little bit, at that 30 billion mark, that's like 3% of the entire department's budget. 70 billion, you're getting close to the 5%. And for historical reference, that's kind of what the US has spent when it's gone for its big new efforts. That's about what we spent to get the ICBMs fielded. It's about that much every year. It's about what we spent to put the fleet ballistic missiles coming out of submarines. So you get to that a few percent dedicated to one thing, you start seeing that national priority. I already said it went across administration, so you see national priority. And I think that illustrates all the points the general just made.
Great. Is it, it's also potentially in response to these large investments we've seen out of the Chinese Communist Party, right, to focus on their national priority, which would be parity in space, and then potentially overmatch. So do we see sort of these, a natural response to that increase in defense spending in China, or do you think that we are, I guess my follow-up question is it a natural response to do this, or are we responding in a way that might go too far? Yeah.
Way to tip it over into a different question.
Very different.
Once again, your original framing of what has changed, but you picked 5 years, right? What has changed over the longer time frame is that return of great power competition, right? Is that we are facing, and in the Cold War, when we faced Soviets, they would lie and we would choose to believe them, which when we finally walked out at the end, we looked around like, holy cow, the US military is amazing, and the Soviets never quite got there. That is not how the Chinese have approached it, right? They set up to do something and they tend to do it. Now, always a difficult question. How do you get the balance right at any moment, especially in a domain that is changing both technologically and operationally? So everybody's learning those lessons. That's why we have a Space Force with General Miller watching that and trying to figure out. And that's why Congress has to stay up, keeping tabs to try to find what that right moment is.
Okay. Thanks. All right. We'll shift down to Eric, representing a commercial industry on the panel. The space industrial base provides critical capabilities to both U.S. defense and commercial, civil, and societal customers. Given so much of the industry depends on a safe and secure orbital environment, how do you think about the current threat landscape, and what does that mean for how you approach building and delivering space capabilities to all these various customer sets?
Yeah, great question. So first and foremost, the threat environment doesn't get lost on us. And knowing when we're entrusted from the federal government to build capacity for them to help in this effort, we're always dialed in on that as a priority, actively managing those programs, spending resources as we need to, and maybe making sure we execute those and deliver them on schedule. Because I think what we just heard is the time that this cycle is moving is much faster than it used to be. Put a satellite up, wait for 20 years for it to die, put another satellite up. Now the refresh rate and the threat refresh rate is exactly the same. Just keep thinking about how fast you get a new iPhone. It's the same thing for space. I mean, it is going that quickly. So for us, we have to be dialed in on making sure when we propose programs to the government that we know we can build, we build them and we deliver them when they need them. We don't do things that we aren't good at. That's a very important part of industry. Certain people in industry are good for some things and some are not. We don't spend time after things where you go after everything. So like in some of these cases, in some of these orbits, we don't participate greatly. That's not our skill set. We participate where we are good and we try to focus there. And I think you start to see some of that shaping the ecosystem, because even though we're spending a lot of resources, the continued amount of spending over time is the important piece, because trying to create an industry that responds to a demand signal on year one and wires a delivery on year 2 or year 3 is a whole supply chain. And there's a lot of differences between satellite low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and geostationary Earth orbit. The level of radiation protection that you put on those satellites to survive space weather is completely different. So the amount of subcomponents and subsystems that need to be protected are greater. So the demand signal matters where the tool will be used. So we think about all of this, and we think about doing the things we're best qualified for the customer. And then when it comes to capacity, in some of our businesses, we have a really large satellite factory and a small satellite factory. In the ones that turn more quickly, we've made investments in capital material to expand the capacity, knowing that it's coming, and to increase the rate. So I think that's kind of how we participate. And also, maybe lastly, we also partner with new space companies in addition to just going after things on our own. It's not that we always have to be the leader or the prime. We go and we can support others where we have certain capabilities where they would best benefit as well.
Great, thank you. All right, time to pick on Russell one more time. Question here for you is, there's an ongoing debate whether the U.S. needs to more aggressively field offensive space capabilities. We already heard a pretty good argument from that for those, the need for those, but how should we think about the offensive defensive balance in a domain where rules are still being written and there aren't necessarily well understood norms and behaviors across nations?
We've already heard from everybody about that change in the space domain. General Saltzman, when in his objective force, when he describes, we had always could use space for strategic effects, right? Because it was so close to nuclear war, we got to achieve deterrent effects, allowing us to use space differently. Rep. Turner's there talking about setting off a nuclear detonation. That changes it yet again, right? That puts you right back in the deterrence aspect. How do you make sure nobody pulls the trigger? that is always a slippery slope, even as we deal with changing environment, new technology, new possibilities. And so then you do prepare for what the generals called war fighting, right? How do you prepare for those little engagements? We know that nuclear weapons do not stop us from fighting wars. We fought wars, our adversaries have fought wars, the Russians invaded Ukraine, but those have stayed limited. They have never become total war. How do we prepare just in case we need to fight a limited war in space, while at the same time recognizing that a total war, the detonating of a nuclear weapon in space, the destruction of the orbits as usable, has ramifications much more than whatever that immediate moment in the geopolitical situation is.
Thank you. Okay, a question, or pivot a little bit to policy now. And it's a question for everybody. If you could make a policy change or an investment decision to improve our national position in space, what would it be? We'll start with you, General.
Thanks for all the easy questions. I think probably, I'll be honest with you, in many ways, I think we've seen it in the last few months. I have an executive order, frankly, that doesn't just apply to the national security or the Department of War, that applies to NASA, applies to the Department of Commerce, applies to the entire executive branch, the entire federal government. But it's an executive order the president has signed out that the U.S. will ensure space superiority for all those reasons you started talking about. It talks about the economic benefits, the science technology benefits. There's biotech benefits, everything from prosperity, rare earths, you name it. There are all kinds of benefits that we derive, potentially could derive in the future, even more so, from our ability to access space. And there's a now policy that says it is the policy of the United States in an executive order that we will ensure our freedom of action into and from the space station. Now, it does give us, particularly me, in the Space Force, some specific tasks from the military dimension in order to do that. But from a policy standpoint, I'll say the macro frame is there between that document and the national district. I think that's there. What I think, I would ask for, I'm in good standing here because I get to say the president's budget.
I was impressed that you just lead with that sentence.
Exactly, yes. There's a difference between the current military and the Space Force, what I would say in the past. Ultimately, the president's budget, as enacted is a law, right? So by definition, it is policy determined by our Congress, ratified and signed by our president, right? So I would ask that the investment, take a look at it. We have challenged, and just yesterday I was on the phone having a call with people on this side of the river about things that are in that budget. And it is appropriate that you ask about those things that are in that budget. It is appropriate that you want to hear about our logic. I think we can and will defend it effectively. I think that the one thing I would say is, if there's a recognition, and I take it by your attendance here today, there's at least curiosity, if not a recognition, of the U.S.'s dependence. It's not just the military. The U.S.'s dependence on space to underscore our prosperity, our way of life, frankly, our position globally, I would argue. If that's true, then you need to understand that just like any domain, it is going to be contested. And we have to invest in this case, the military dimension, largely the Space Force, but it's really every dimension. NASA is making an effort to go back to the moon, as you saw, just a great, I don't know that anybody estimated how many kids, parents, relatives, people from other countries will be talking about the progress we were making back in human spaceflight exploration back to the moon and beyond. I didn't see that coming, I'll be honest with you. It's more popular than I thought it was. This is not just something that is about the United States military. The advantages we derive, dependence we have on space power, are the entirety of the U.S. as well as our global alliance structure, I would argue. In so doing, I think we need to invest and make a policy choice that, hey, we've got to fund what it takes to protect and defend and continue to allow us to operate with that level of advantage. I think the choices are stark if you don't. And I think that those are things that we can argue, and it's good to have a debate about.
Yeah, David, you've already teased this as an analyst. It's easier to look back, right? It's easy to talk about the Cold War because we know what happened. Looking forward is the hard one. And in this moment, if I could just wish for that one magic wand you're talking about, it's finding the right balance. How do we prepare without provoking? How do we field independent options in space while still providing support that Joint Force has come to depend on? How do we figure out and field the right capabilities without going funding overkill on a bunch of capabilities that we never actually end up using? That's a magic thing. I think General Miller has given you a great case for why he's presented the budget he has to you this year.
The only thing I would add is more of a cross-government collaboration on working together. And I know this happens, but I think in other situations, I think when we had hazards for biotechnology or threats of different things, there was things that DHS led to get everybody together to react to these things. I feel like that might be something of interest. From a business case perspective and the industry, I think putting on a piece of paper the value lost if what the congressman said earlier happened, what the impact of the country would be, I think that would enable much more clear investment decisions in terms of trade-offs and values over time. If you were to do estimates of impacts to food development, I mean, nobody knows or nobody's tracking perhaps that companies like John Deere and others are like literally marking like to the millimeter where they're putting a seed, where they're actually knowing the capability of the soil. And it's all remote via satellite. I mean, it is insanely accurate. And think about the efficiency and productivity of food development creation. I mean, just some of the things we think are so fundamental. If we were to put a price tag on what it would be to not have all of those things, there's a great article, there's a great like page 2 in the Future Operating Environment, talks about what life's like without the Joint Force, without space services, and what life is like without the country with space services. Just read it, 2 nice bubble graphs. There's a lot of very frightening things in there for both our Joint Force and our country. I think having a number value on it of what you're trying to avoid would also be helpful for people like Kate and the Congress and policymakers to understand why 5% makes sense for some period of time, maybe 6, maybe 7. I don't know the right answer, but I think look at it from what we'd be losing. That would be something on a trade space.
We've published a paper, The Value Base, if you'd like to see examples of everything the congressman listed and Eric just talked about.
$50. Here you go. Yeah, no, just kidding.
Just put your money in the thing on the back.
And every time I read one of those articles, that there's something new that space is providing to society, whether it's environmental or oil and gas or finance or agriculture, like you said. It just, the list going on and on and on. And I remember the director of national intelligence, Intel manager for space, used to hold a workshop called A Day Without Space. And it forced everyone to think about, what if we lost these capabilities on orbit, and how would that reduce our efficiency and effectiveness as a society? And how would that hurt, right, financially across the board? So I think it's great to bring that up. We talked a little bit about proliferated satellite constellations. And so, General Miller, I'm going to ask you, the Space Force has been pursuing more proliferated constellations than ever before. You talked about the shift historically from capabilities that were in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force that have now moved to space. We're doing it again with the AWACS mission, moving target indicator to space, and other missions like JSTARS, moving target indicator to space, right? So this requires these proliferated architectures with smaller, short-lived satellites that requires a massive replenishment and sustainment operation. So how confident are you that we can sustain and replenish these constellations?
I think we're very confident, and mostly I would say it's because you're already seeing it occur. So the value proposition, part of the value proposition wasn't just the military advantage to be derived from moving to proliferated architectures. There was, I think it was Aaron that made the point that, we engineered a very expensive satellite for 20 plus years, and that's why they all cost billions of dollars, to launch them. Well, that's just to operate them, frankly. That's not even incorporating the launch costs in many cases. So what we have gone to is, in some cases, depending on the architecture, hundreds, dozens of spacecraft, space vehicles in different orbits, depending on the mission that we're trying to execute. and an assumption of what their design life would be based off of that orbit. Typically, what you would see, this is what the same and everything, what you might see is about a 3 to 5 year design epic for low Earth orbit proliferated satellites. I think Eric mentioned that time. So what we are already seeing in the Tranche 0, which is basically the proliferated LEO Earth orbit missile warning and tracking architecture, is the performance in tracking is better than we thought. And the advantage that we can already build into the next generation, which is Tranche 2, go beyond Tranche 1, and refresh is already being resourced in this program and planned for launch in 2027. So we are already planning, because we started to do proliferated LEO in one case, missile warning and tracking mostly, has already demonstrated a level of performance and tracking to the advanced threats that we are seeing today. And we're able to actually leverage, because we can build in advances and take advantage of better planar ranges and other things that industry is doing for us. We're already building in that advantage. So rather than 25 years and no upgrade or improvement, we're now iterating on 3 to 5 year design life cycles and spiraling in new vendors and new capabilities as part of the design. And your cost point goes from billions to trying to get down to the low tens of millions or even $10 million in some cases. Now that depends on the mission of what you're trying to do, but there was a value proposition here. And the value proposition was, you're buying this anyway. The difference is I'm not able to improve at the pace of technology, and I'm not actually driving and leveraging commercial. And simultaneously, I'm presenting great targets for an adversary with just a handful of platforms. And that was the logic of our shift. So I would say that the reason we're confident in it is because we're already seeing the advances we thought we'd see in the tech base in many cases. And you're already seeing the resourcing to go back and reconstitute where needed or supplement in other cases. I think it's so good that when I have meetings with allies about the potential of what adversaries are doing, they're asking me about how do we look at these proliferated constellations ourselves, because they see the benefits of leveraging our commercial enterprise, pacing technology at the rate that we just couldn't imagine in the past. And instead of just operating and sustaining for decades, we plan on epics that upgrade and improve at much more faster refresh cycles and timelines. So I think the reason I'm confident is because we're doing it. And the reason I think we're going to be able to refresh it is, while there's certainly a pace in the 27 program, if you look at it, I mean, there's thousands of space vehicles in there that we would wind up launching in total over the program. We're up to 100 launches a year down at Patrick. And none of these, as opposed to just one server goes up on a heavy launch vehicle to get to GEO, we're launching, in some cases, tens or dozens to get these satellites on orbit. And that's hundreds of launches a year, and I'm not even the main customer down at Cape Canaveral. It's actually the commercial enterprise is the main customer of all those launches. So I think the capacity is there. We've already seen the refresh rate and the ability to leverage technology. And I think that because of good partnership and explanation of both on our side of the river and also here, I think Congress has seen the value and is willing to support us and appropriate the dollars needed to do the refresh. So I'm very confident we can do it. There's some missions that are so exquisite and so unique that they're going to be bespoke to what the U.S. military's requirements are. But where we can, we try to just leverage as much commercial technology as we can. And I think it's paying off. So.
Fantastic. And Eric, you already mentioned that your company has invested in supply chain to support the sustained pace of proliferated operations. Do you feel that writ large the industrial base is ready for sort of hot replenishment at this pace?
I would say I agree with the general. The investment's coming, the supply chain's getting built. I think the part that we all think about going forward is the talent base. And Artemis is an awesome kickstart to something like that for, K through 12, graduate and postgraduate. I think we see that as the bigger problem. On the talent side, the demand for it is just insane, especially in the space market, competing with each other. But I think back to a policy perspective, it was an effort on the talent side to improve the education and the interest in space all the way through postgraduate. I think that would also help long-term from the industry, from technician to design, systems engineering, all the way to, kind of advanced spacecraft design. I think that would be super helpful because it's going to be moving so quickly. It's going to be as well understood as how to put together an iPhone. And I think that would be an invaluable asset for us to keep moving forward, get more and more people in there. Because if we keep shrinking the workforce or getting drawn to other places, that's going to be the probably thing we need to watch out for. It isn't necessarily, there's not a budget line for the Space Force, or there's not a budget line Cape could look at of how can we do that. But I mean, it's beyond STEM. NASA does this really well, but maybe it's a focus on space STEM, just as a thought. I'm sure that's in your paper too. Yeah.
Great thought. Okay, we basically have 5 minutes left. So if we can keep our answers crisp and short, we could take a couple questions from the audience. So we'll start with you, sir.
I wondered, the congressman who spoke indicated there's a 6-7 treaty with Russia regarding space weapons and keeping weapons of certain nature, nuclear weapons out of space. I wondered, is the Golden Dome a violation of treaty? Is the 6-7 treaty still in force, or is it need to be removed? Is it in conflict with the old START treaty, which I've heard has passed in history, but could be removed or redone and put out again? How does all that fit in your plans? Does the Golden Dome restrict what you can do, or is it conflict with what you do, or is it an advantage?
So there was like 9 questions there. But to summarize it, and I'll give the team an opportunity, but I think he was referring to the Outer Space Treaty and the particular violation he saw in the potential fielding of a nuclear-capable anti-satellite was the prohibition in the Outer Space Treaty on putting weapon mass destruction on orbit. So when you look at the discussion we are having in America about Golden Dome and fielding conventional capability to intercept potentially nuclear-armed weapons that are being launched at North America, the answer to that is no. That does not in any way put a weapon of mass destruction on orbit in violation of the Outer Space Treaty. The START Treaty, I think it's been well documented that Russia was non-compliant, that the president is working now in policy channels to see what can be arranged on a larger discussion on nuclear weapons. But that's really something for the policy team to answer and not really something I can answer. But back to the original point, no, there's nothing about Golden Dome that puts weapons of mass destruction on orbit in violation of the Outer Space Treaty, and the U.S. is a signatory to the Outer Space Treaty. For that matter, so is Russia, but that doesn't seem to prevent them from doing things that are violate treaties, which is sort of what their pattern is.
Okay, I think we could take another question in the back.
This is a question regarding, I think we are reaching out kind of the geospatial data from and how commercially accessible it is and how we're seeing that analysis correlate with artificial intelligence. And I think this last conflict was really eye-opening in regards to how commercial entities are being utilized in kind of militaristic ways. So how do you see the balance, kind of what we talked about before, of like the continued commercial development, but also understanding that it presents more of a national security threat than ever before?
Okay, I'll start. I totally understand what you're asking. Commercial providers providing imagery intelligence, primarily to the U.S. government. There's a number of companies that have done that over time. Some of them just went public recently. I think there's value in doing that. I think your thought was, is there a risk to them doing it? Most of those capabilities are commercial. The U.S. government kind of regulates what can be available for foreign military sales. So I think it's more of a, put it simply, a regular camera versus maybe one with special attributes. I think I don't see it as an inhibitor from a threat perspective. I think we do need to recognize, though, that as the Earth proliferates with more satellites that have video on it, whether it's for whatever purpose, that, like, I'll use this analogy. I mean, George Orwell, 1984 comes to mind, but I mean, the surveillance of the Earth is going to be probably ubiquitous at some point, and for sure AI will be doing it. What's more threatening, that or the nuke the congressman talked about? I mean, I think you have to have both, and it just has to be regulated. And that's more of a conversation for what do you want someone to allow to be able to sell something commercially and do versus not. Sorry for the long answer. You asked a very complicated question. Yeah.
I like the general use of the phrase driving and leveraging, I think was your second verb. remote sensing is a great example. The number one customer is still the US government or foreign governments. But that is enough to have a viable private company doing very well with their IPO, Hawkeye 360. So that what is commercial, you're having a private company do it even when the government is the number one customer. That is the tension. How do you leverage that when it shows up? But at the same time, how do you make sure you're not just seeding something that isn't going to stand on its own? Something the Boeing crowd is very aware of and is aware.
I think they covered it.
Okay, I think we're good. I'm going to wrap it up there since we're at time. I mean, we heard about the benefits of space. We heard that Russia is the perpetual spoiler of the domain. China is the pacing threat. We need to proliferate for technology refresh. We need a pipeline for talent, and more budget is always better. Please join me in thanking our panel.
More budget is always better. I like that.
More budget always better.
Yes, thank you.
Very nice.